Thank you, Marvin.
Yeah, man.
So it's always a little nerve-wracking when somebody who knows you really well introduces you. Marvin's known me for many years, and we've spent more than a few hours playing loud guitars in Pez and enjoying one another's company, and he's such a blessing to this community. I think, what do you think? I think that Rock for Love is now the definitive music festival in the fall in Memphis, Tennessee. I think it is now the definitive music festival. So I just want to give Marvin a round of applause for that. We've got Memphis in May, and now we've got Rock for Love. And 6 years ago when Marv started that, I'm not sure that anybody knew it would grow to such epic proportions. So thank you, Marvin. I'm going to talk for just a few minutes about bicycles. But really what I'm going to talk about is, to the degree to which there was a strategy, the kind of strategy that I used over time to communicate a specific sort of message about bicycles in this context. So 10 years ago, in 2002, when we started Revolution's Community Bicycle Shop, people thought I was crazy, and I was. But what we really believed at that time was there can be more spaces for people to ride their bicycles safely. We also believed that there could be better access to affordable bicycles and bicycle materials. I'm not sure how many of you have taken your bike in for a tune-up recently, but it's pretty costly, right? It's not cheap. And so we had an idea at that time that there were people who relied on their bikes, who depended on them, and we wanted to provide them access to materials. And I'll tell you a little bit more about how we made that work. But again, this is about the arc of the message that we created over a 10-year period that has, I think, had some pretty resonant implications, not only for the way we do business here in Memphis, but also for the way that Memphis is perceived nationally. So it wasn't too long ago, and I'll talk about this, that Memphis was called one of the worst cities for bicycling in the United States. It was one of the many lists that we appear on that provide our city with a dubious distinction, right? That really matters. Working at Rhodes College, we've now got students from 47 states in over 20 countries, and they come to our city with a very specific idea of what it's like. These lists matter. But now here we are in 2012, and we've just been named the most improved city for bicycling. We've got this Harahan Bridge project coming online. We're participating in the Green Lane project. It seems like there's a new bike lane being paved every single day in the city of Memphis. So how do we get there? How do we go from 2002, people think you're crazy for trying to work with poor people to get bikes going, to 2012, now Memphis is really turning into a place that's known for promoting bicycling? That's what I want to talk to you a little bit about today. And what I just want to start with is two simple ideas that I think are kind of big at the same moment, right? The first one is these things don't happen by accident. They are done in an intentional way by people who are thinking about how to create a new kind of context, how to take something that wasn't present before and make it thus and so. The social movements of the 20th century is something that I've studied closely, and I feel very much like what's happening in Memphis with bicycling is kind of a social movement. So in other words, this isn't an accident. It's all happened over time because people have worked at it. The second thing is, and I think this is where you guys come in, I'm not a communications expert. That's Marvin's job. That's you guys' job. I was actually trained as a historian, right? And so we're going to look at some pictures and look at some text, but I'm going to try not to be a boring historian. You guys will have to just rate me at the end. But I do want to say that one idea about communication that really is compelling to me is the idea that Sally McFaig put out in one of her books. She says, you have to be careful how you see the world because that's how it is, right? You have to be careful how you see the world because that's how it is. And we've always heard the perception is reality cliche. But I think what Sally McFaig is getting at there is that it's more than just the way you perceive things is real, right? The way that you approach the world and the way that you see the world really are inextricably linked, right? And so that's why I start with this slide. I love Memphis. That's what Memphis kind of looks like to me on most days, right? It's those people having fun on their scooters, riding bikes. And every day, I really do think it's a blessing for me to be in this city. So as one of our former mayors said, I try to shake the haters off. All right. So this quote was attributed to Mark Twain, and I don't know if he really said it. Did he really say it?
Yes, he did.
Okay. So I think it's a pretty good quote, though, right? A lie can circle the earth 9 times before the truth can get its shoes on, right? Or its pants, or whatever the truth is wearing. And I think that's really good, and it really underlines the importance of message, right? And that's something that I've begun to think a lot more about, because promoting biking in Memphis, even though we have a lot of success, it often means that you have to intentionally deal with things that are not true, because not everybody's necessarily a big fan of putting bike lanes in. So where did it all start, right? It's a hard picture to see because you guys are probably in the back and it's kind of small. But this is Revolution's Community Bicycle Shop. It really isn't much. Basically, it's a pile of bikes, a set of lockers in the back, and a Home Depot bucket. And then we had some tools that were donated and a stand that really didn't stand up. So in 2002, this is what we had to work with, meager materials. And we had an article that came out in June of that year. Young men with tattoos and body piercings, grease-stained hands, and visions of a bicycling utopia are mounting a revolt in a Cooper Young church basement. Then my grandmother had a heart attack. But that was kind of the way it was perceived at this time. We were asking people to donate all their old bike stuff, give it to us. We're going to try to help kids work on these bikes, get some bikes that are reliable, that are safe, give them a little education about how to ride in the roadway. But this is kind of how it was framed. At this time, I was 18, I said, we're going to try to get as many people on bicycles as we can, right? That was what I wanted to do. That was really the goal. So how did we do that? We had a bike bazaar, of course. That was our first event in June of that year. We had a cake bike walk. We had a Big People on Little Bikes race, and we had a lot of fun. And we invited the neighborhood kids out, and we had absolutely no idea what we were doing, right? We just opened the doors. We had a bunch of bikes and a bunch of tools, and we tried to make a shop, and we tried to make a difference. Now this time, 2002, I said Memphis could be a much better city for cycling with a few simple changes, right? Little did I know, simple was not the word. So Marvin's like rattling off all of these committees that I served on, and frankly, I have to be completely honest with you, it sounds kind of boring, and it is kind of boring, right? You get involved with all these committees, they're talking about, site triangles, and engineers are telling you about technical specifications and how many parking spaces you can have. I mean, there is an avalanche of information that people can use to snow you with, right? To say, this just isn't going to work. So at the time, I thought it was going to be simple, but little did I know it was going to be a lot more complicated than that. So from humble beginnings, we started to craft this movement. Now at this time, this is a very impressive picture for me because this was before Marvin was my fashion consultant. I had a lot more hair. That's me kneeling on the ground. And I had a beard that was just out of control. But you can see in the background we've got literally piles of bikes in this church basement, and we just started working with folks in the neighborhood. That's all we knew how to do. I knew how to fix bikes, and I thought this is how I can make a difference. But it wasn't too long before people started taking notice, right? You've got these folks who are doing something a little bit different in the bicycling community. They're not a traditional bike shop. You don't pay money and go in and get your bike fixed. They actually want you to kind of come down here and do something. So the Memphis Flyer approached me in 2004, and they wanted to talk a little bit about, hey, can we really make this cycling city that you're talking about possible? I mean, at that time, I don't know, it's probably not hard for you guys to conceive. There was nothing here. We didn't even have signs that said, hey, you can use this recreational route. There was absolutely nothing. Yet and still, I said in 2004, in 10 years, this city's going to be a cycling mecca, right? There's room here for things to grow, and with this plan, a lot is going to change. Once the conditions and facilities improve, more people will be out riding in the streets and it'll be safer, right? I'm just making this up, right? I'm just telling people, like, hey, I'm pretty sure this is going to work, right? But this is in 2004. And actually, as I looked back on this stuff, I was reminded of what Dr. Scott Morris said about the Church Health Center. We were just too naive to think that it wouldn't work, right? We just thought, oh, we're going to communicate about it, and we'll get some bike lanes put out there, and they'll put them out there. So that's what we did largely at the outset. Now, again, I'm a historian, so I love old grainy pictures. So I scanned in a couple of these old articles. And the reason I did it was because these articles were featured in the Lamplighter newspaper. So for some of you guys who live in Cooper Young, you may know about this. And the reason that's important is because very few people read the Lamplighter newspaper, right? But they said to me, hey, would you write a little bit about what's going on with your bicycle shop and kind of your vision for a bike-friendly city? And I was like, yeah, sure, I'll do that, right? Not really realizing that 3 people were going to read it. But I did it at that time, and the reason I'm sharing it with you today is because the slow work matters. It matters a lot. Taking the opportunity to write little op-eds like that in a neighborhood newspaper made a huge difference. And what's in the center there, and you can't really see the title because it's obscured by all that grain, But my friend Andy Ashby, right, who some of you probably know professionally, writes for the Business Journal, he said, you know, some of these things that you've been writing, I'm kind of into that. I think I'd like to write a little bit about bicycles. And so he wrote a little piece, right? And now, if you ever read the Business Journal, he's on the beat covering all this bike stuff, right? So that little work mattered. And that community in Cooper Young really became a catalyst for a lot of what would turn into a much bigger campaign as we went forward. But at that time, I said, those of us who've spent more than 5 minutes on a Memphis street know well the trepidation and apprehension such an experience can inspire. But then people were like, you know, you're saying that we can get better, but I'm just telling you it's unsafe. And I was like, ye of little faith. I said, I toss around my flagrant optimism regarding citywide progress, and then people tell me we'll believe it when we see it, right? You guys know that mentality, the Memphis mentality, right? We've always been this way. We aren't going to get any better, right? This is what people constantly leveled at me. But this is what I said in the conclusion of creating a bike-friendly article back in 2005. It is us as Memphians who will lead the way for local government. And as youth, I really took seriously the idea that we were really young people doing this. I was 19 at the time. As youth, we can serve as excellent ambassadors for this new era in our city's history, right? So that's what I was writing about back in 2005. Again, too naive to know any better, but really stoked about what was going on. So in 2006, some of you guys may remember Walnut Grove was being redone out by Shelby Farms. That turned into a major flashpoint. The committee that I served on back in 2005 had really been pushing the city to consider providing access for bicycle riders across Walnut Grove. Why would you want to do that? Because Shelby Farms Park is right there. And essentially what was happening is they were creating this very auto-centric, frankly unfriendly facility for bicyclists and pedestrians. Many people perceive that as a barrier to getting to Shelby Farms on your bicycle. Now you got to remember at this time, the Shelby Farms Green Line was still a glimmer in people's eye, right? Nobody really thought that was going to happen. So it was a huge, huge deal. So you've got some press picking this up in 2006. And you know, there were a lot of very angry people about this in the community. But I tried to sort of stay even-keeled, but still call out the city and say we can do better. All in all, we haven't made a commitment to bicycling yet. That was true. In 06, we really had not made a commitment. Wayne Gaskins was our city engineer at the time, and he really wasn't into thinking in new ways. For a long time, I'm not sure how many of you guys know this, the reason that the engineer told us we didn't have any bicycle facilities is because we had sewer grates that weren't properly designed, right? That was the reason. And publicly, he stated that very, very often. So again, you get snowed with all of this information about why you can't do things. But I tried to make the point that it's not just about getting people on bikes. It's about improving the economic situation in our city and improving the quality of life. Again, I'm like, 20, so I really just don't know what I'm talking about, but it's working pretty well. All right, in 2006, this guy, John Nelson, who moved up to Seattle, I don't know if you guys used to read his Life Cycles column, but it was great. He decided he wanted to do a little piece on what we were doing down at Revolutions, right? And this I think is very important and had been my focus from the start, but I began to zone in a lot more on this message. We want to create a community of bicyclists, right? And we want everybody to be a part of it. Even if you're not a cyclist, you're not a spandex warrior, right? Even if you're not somebody who doesn't have all the gear, right? We want you to be a part of the community of bicyclists. We were trying to enlarge, in other words, this notion of what it meant to be someone who rode a bike, to include as many people as possible. And we also just said, you can actually be a part of this. We gave somebody a very simple thing that they could do. Donate an old bicycle. And I was talking earlier with some folks who gave some bikes to our program, right? And you come down to the shop, you see all this energy, and we're really building dreams out of bike grease and old nuts and bolts. And so that was really important, and the commercial appeal began to pick up on that in 2006. More and more people are now saying, what's going on with this bicycle shop? The issue is growing in people's minds. And by 2007, I'm saying these kinds of things. We want to transform the relationship that an individual has to their bike shop and its community, right? So we're moving beyond just saying, hey, we've got some bikes, we want to fix them up, we want to get kids going. We want people to think a little bit more about that thing that's in their garage that they haven't worked on or haven't looked at in years. We want them to think a little bit differently about the institution of a bicycle shop. We weren't just repairing bikes. We were actually really trying to reconceptualize our city. And that was a tough thing to do when you've just got bicycles. But the flyer picked that up, and they quoted us on a lot of these ideas. And then in the Getting Around article, I said, I see a direct link between creating bicycle facilities and reclaiming streets for a healthier way of life. This is what we know. We know that if your street is not safe for you to ride your bicycle, if you don't have a sidewalk, you're probably not going to ride a bike and you're probably not going to walk. We know that. We also know that we have obesity rates that are higher here than the rest of the country, right? And so for me in 2007, I'm starting to put two and two together and I'm going, I think there's a relationship between the built environment and some of these bigger problems that we have with public health, right? But I also, through my work with the MPO and trying to work with the city, I also felt that there was an issue with citizens being able to have a piece of input into the public process, right? And so we wanted to be actively engaged in that process. And frankly, that was probably the most difficult thing at the time. Still, the press is being really supportive. In 2007, the Commercial Appeal says, well, frankly, let me be honest about this. Marvin Stockwell and I were talking on the phone, and he's like, you should write a bicycling column. We got all these articles coming out, right, about the stuff that's going on. They're quoting revolutions and da-da-da. But Marv's like, you need to have some space where you can write this. He's like, Dr. Morris is talking about health. You should talk about bikes. And I was like, okay, sign me up. So I wrote this column for free for years and years and years and had a great time doing it. But I wanted to these are the first 3 columns that I wrote. And that picture is just something else. But look, it gets bigger as you kind of go down there, which is unfortunate. But these are the first 3 columns that I wrote, and I want to explain why I think these are important. Drivers can learn ways of sharing the road. That was the first time that we really started to publicly talk about the requirement that drivers learn how to navigate the streets safely with bicycle riders, because it is a two-way street, to use an unfortunate pun, right? But it was kind of a nice way of saying it, right? We can cooperate. We can work together. The second one, group rides, quick route to courage and knowledge. I knew that there were people who had been promoting bicycling in this city for many years. The Memphis Hightailers, the local bike shops, they had these group rides going on, and what I wanted to do was celebrate those efforts. But I also wanted to blaze a trail to those places and say, hey guys, we're kind of all in this together, and when you're going out on a group ride, you're not just trying to burn some calories, and make your calves look a little bit better. You're also inviting new people into the community of bicycle riders, and that's a place where they can learn skills and where they can feel a sense of belonging. And then the last one, small changes can tip attitudes. You guys have probably read Malcolm Gladwell's book, The Tipping Point, right? It's a fantastic read, how little things can make a big difference. And I used that text as a way to describe how little bitty things, right, like the way that bicycle riders share the road with motorists, signaling, being respectful, and vice versa. Also, making small accommodations like installing share the road signs, putting in bike lanes, how that can really make a big change in the fabric of our city. So this was in 2007, and I began to introduce those ideas. Connect with constituents who are already doing great work, right? Encourage a little bit of movement, and then provide some suggestions about the specifics of where we might want to go. So that was how I sort of approached the column at the outset. And this is just to augment that point, right? Towards the end of 2007 and 2008, the Greater Memphis Green Line was really working to get this Green Line project going. At that time, right, before most Memphians really knew much about it, I sensed that this was a huge deal, that it could be the tipping point, right, to get the issue kind of moving in the right direction publicly. And so I wrote this: Memphians love to ride their bikes. On the road, off the road, over cyclocross barriers. Some of you guys may know Joe Royer, who owns Outdoors, and he's been doing this cyclocross race for years. So I was kind of giving him a little plug. I said many Memphians would love to ride their bikes to work too, if it were safer. And I celebrated the Safe Routes to School program and the efforts of the Greater Memphis Green Line, right? Again, to give it a little bit of public nudge, a little bit of public support, and sort of share this idea that we now know, looking back, was a really good idea, but at this time it was still very much in the embryonic stage. So this, I think, this was when things really started to break open. Again, we had been working with the city, making all these little nudges publicly, trying to also promote specific kinds of designs to accommodate bicycle riders. And at long last, largely as a result of the outrage in the community about Walnut Grove, the city said, we're going to put in our first bicycle lanes, right? Ladies and gentlemen, this was 2008, right? So even though we were a little behind, we were really stoked. We were excited, right? The city's going to do something. We never thought they'd do it. So this is a group of 4 of us, and I think it's such a classic picture, right? There's this huge Suburban behind us, and like 16 other cars, 25,000 safety barrels, and then like the 4 of us, right? Just trying to get over to a public meeting to talk about these bike lanes. And I think it really sort of, it captures the small force, right, of bicycle riders who were really trying to make a big change. And this was on the front page of the paper back in 2008. And we were really relieved, and it was kind of amazing. And then things started to happen quite quickly. We also know a couple of other things happened in 2008, right? The economic collapse occurred. And so there was a lot more discussion about what does it mean that we're traveling 22.5 miles on average one way to get to work, right? And we're spending a lot of money on gas. And, you know, people were increasingly having to tighten their belts. So the CA is running this article, Gas Prices Fuel Bikes Favor, right? So you've got these other forces that are now coming to bear on the issue. And then on the other side, I really tried to expand the notion of what we were doing. Bicycle use indicates people-friendly town. When you've got people moving around on their bicycles, it communicates, hey, this is the kind of place where you want to hang out, where you want to live, where you want to take your kid on a walk, where you want to start a business, where you might want to buy a home. So I started to introduce some of these ideas, and I used some precedents from other places. And you know, it's always a good thing to just say the time's never been right, never been better for getting on a bicycle, right? The time is always right. So I shared those in a couple of columns that year in 2008 as the issue then began to gather more and more momentum. And then in 2008, Bicycling Magazine, does anybody know how big the readership of Bicycling Magazine is? Anybody want to guess? 100,000? Oh. 500,000. Well, they claim to reach millions of people with their magazine, right? It's, I think, the largest bicycling publication. They claim a readership of 46 million people globally, right? So I just put that in perspective, right? I mean, if you're a bicycle person, any bike shop's going to have one of their magazines. A lot of people, okay? And so they rated, and it's hard to see because the slideshow is so small, but we were rated one of the worst cities for cycling in 2008. Now remember, all of this momentum is building in the city. We're feeling pretty stoked. Like, we're getting some traction here. We got 3.2 miles of bike lanes, right? We're getting something done here in Memphis. But, you know, by national standards, Bicycling Magazine was a bit disappointed. They didn't share our enthusiasm for the changes that have been going on in Memphis. Now, at the same time, I was getting into trouble in other places. So while I was a student at Rhodes, in 2008, you know, it marked 40 years after Dr. King had been assassinated here. And as Marvin mentioned, one of my passions is civil rights history. And our college hadn't really made a commitment to commemorating King in any big specific way. So we did a sit-in. We thought it would be great. We sat in on the seal at Rhodes College, and then the paper turned up, and then they put this on the front page of the paper. So it's kind of funny. You know, you're trying to moderate your message, and then you're on the front page of the paper saying injustice is here. That's just how the cards fall sometimes. The next slide is, does anybody remember the Sustainable Shelby Initiative? And I'll tell you why this was important. Okay. So then County Mayor Wharton, he said, I want to make Shelby County into a county that is on a sustainable trajectory, not only environmentally, but also financially, right? He began to see the connection between those two things. So he appointed me to serve on the Traffic and Transportation Committee, and it's hard to see, but bike-friendly communities was one of the top 10 recommendations in the Sustainable Shelby Initiative. After that initiative was the first time you see Mayor Wharton talking publicly about bicycles. It was after that that he then started to campaign on putting 500 miles of bicycle lanes in Memphis and Shelby County. That was the first time you see that stuff appearing in his platform. And I share that once again to say the slow work matters. I went to a lot of very grueling meetings with people who really thought that the future of transportation in our city was cars that could move 60,000, streets that could move 60,000 cars a day, right? They weren't thinking, and you know, maybe we improved the bus routes. But I won't share the name, but you know, one of the people who was involved in these meetings, he stood up and responded to a comment I'd made where I'd just returned from Chicago, and I said, you know, I went to Chicago, they have a single map for all of the bus routes in the city of Chicago. The north side's on the front, south side's on the back. There's the grid of Chicago, and then the bus routes are overlaid. I was like, it was so easy to use. We were jumping on the buses, going back and forth, and he stood up and he said, young man, what I don't think you understand is that that won't work in Memphis, right? The Memphis mentality was pervasive, right, in these committee meetings. I felt like I was surrounded by sharks, right? But we pushed, and finally we ended up with this recommendation, and it made a difference. And the mayor started talking a lot more about bicycles after that. So the slow work matters. All right, so towards the middle of 2009, the CSX Green Line looked like it was going to be a thing, right? And so I sent this article to my editor at the time at the Commercial Appeal, and she said, we can't run this. And I was like, why not? And she said, well, people already know about the Green Line, and I think it's sort of like an advocacy piece that you're doing here. So I went back and I reread the article, and I had posted it on my blog, right? And I called it an exclusive piece for my readership of 15 people. And so they got onto my blog and nobody read it. But I did go back and I looked at it, and I said 4 years ago, a group of what Sid Lerner, described as do-gooders organized themselves, and they wanted to turn the CSX rail line into a multi-use path. 4 years later, 3 radically different cost estimates, and $7 million later, a handshake deal has been reached for about half of the land in question, right? So we still weren't quite there. But I wanted to make the point, I believed before this happened, that for bicyclists in particular, the Green Line may represent the single biggest step forward in Memphis history, right? Again, I really saw that as being the tipping point, but that was not unanimous. I'm not sure how many of you guys remember the debates around the Green Line, right, at that time. But one of the best moments of my life, we were at a meeting at Rhodes last year, and a councilman for the city stood up and he said, I'd really like to see these bicycle lanes on North Parkway, and I just want you to know, I want to be completely honest here, I have not always been a fan of bicycles. He said, I was one of the people who said, do not put in that CSX Green Line for bicycle riders. It will create more crime. And he said, I'm not proud of it today, but I do want to be honest with you and say I was completely wrong about that, right? So, see, at this time, there were still a lot of naysayers. We didn't have much to use as reference, right? We had the VECA Green Line, but people really didn't understand it. This was also the time when I took more unflattering pictures of myself, and I also began to talk a little bit more about the international scene. So bringing the biking lifestyle of Copenhagen to Cooper Young, they're like, Copenhagen, where is that, right? But I had been doing all of this research, trying to think, gosh, certainly there have been cities that have transformed themselves in the last 30 years. Who did it, and how did they do it, right? What worked and what didn't work? And so, again, I went over to the Lamplighter. They were like, hey, we want you to write about what's going on with the bike stuff. And I was like, okay. And so I submitted this article, and I talked all about what was going on in Copenhagen. And they had turned this very busy street that was loaded with cars into a pedestrian street. Took all of the cars off of it. It's called it basically is called the stroll. I'm not going to try to imitate Danish for you, but and people said at the time, we're not going to do that. The Danes said, we're not Italians, right? We don't sit outside cafes and drink lattes, right? We want to drive cars down the street. It turns out now the stroll has over 150,000 people passing by it almost every day. And when I went to Copenhagen, and I'll tell you about that in a minute, you could see that firsthand. So I began to introduce some of that stuff into the dialogue as well. But there's always those folks who go, this is Memphis, right? This is Memphis. Like you don't know where you are, right? Yeah, you're right, this is Memphis. So I tried to take seriously, all right, so Memphis has been so far behind, we really kind of suck at this right now. But I really think that we can get somewhere. But the more I worked with the city government, the more I worked with the planning division, the more I saw, boy, we need some fresh ideas and we need some real serious movement if we're actually going to get on the ball on this. So as a student at Rhodes, I was able to apply for this crazy fellowship, the Thomas J. Watson Fellowship, and they give you a bunch of money to go do whatever you want for a full year. It's ridiculous. And then I would tell people as I'm traveling, I'm traveling and I'm doing bike stuff, and they gave me all this money, and they're like, wait, you're doing what? People just didn't understand it, and I didn't understand it, but I went anyway. And they gave me this fellowship to study bicycle cultures, the Thomas J. Watson people. And just before I left, this is what I said about what I wanted to do. I just decided I was going to try and understand what bicycling communities around the world were composed of. The Watson people love that hippy-dippy stuff. They're like, yeah, communities composed of. What does that mean? None of the cities selected were created as bicycle cities. So all the cities had transformed themselves, right, that I went to. And I'm interested in how cities reinvent themselves, right? And then I said, of course, this whole thing, right, Memphis is going to be the best cycling city in the South in 10 years. I just kept saying it, right? I just kept believing it. And we're not talking about investing trillions of dollars. We're talking about small modifications that can change this city in fundamental ways. So that's what I was going to do. And so then I set out and I did it. And the cool thing about being on this trip, that's my friend McKaylee on a tall bike on the far right. I don't know if you can see it, but he's as tall as a traffic light. He's like sitting way on top of that thing. That's me playing bike polo, and that's me putting my bike in a bag to get on a bus to go to Amsterdam. So John Branston from the Flyer, he's like writing me and he's like, oh, can I do a little interview with you? And I'm like, oh, cool, Memphis Press while I'm overseas. And so he does this thing. He talks all about me going to Denmark, the Netherlands, China, Mexico, Australia, getting paid to do it. And basically I said, I developed a community by riding bikes, and that's really true. I went out and I rode with folks. We had good conversations. We had beers afterwards. We built friendships, and I built community that way. That really was what it was about. But then, I threw in this other bit. As I've grown older, I've come to see the bicycle as a solution to some of our nation's most grave problems. So now I'm like opening it up big time, right? I'm overseas. I'm seeing all this crazy bike stuff. I'm like, I can just say whatever I want. Urban sprawl, oil dependence, bad health, a lack of social integration, the bike's going to solve them all, right? And I just said it. So while I was in Denmark, I want to show you this really quick. While I was in Denmark, I got some press as well, which was awesome. And I'm gonna play it for you here.
Jeg fik møde en amerikaner, der hellere end gerne vil have solskin og medvind. Han er i Danmark med en ganske ambitiøs mission. Han vil udbrede cyklisme i USA. Derfor har han trampet rundt i vores land i 8 uger på 2 hjul.
It's not all in Danish.
I like Denmark quite a bit.
Anthony Siracusa, 25 år fra Memphis, Tennessee, hvor der ikke er mange cyklister.
Most kids, they get a bike pretty young, but and they leave it in the garage at 16.
Amerikaneren drømmer om at få sine landsmænd ud af bilerne og op i cykelsadlen.
One of my primary goals is to learn how to create American cities like Copenhagen and like Amsterdam, where people go by bicycle, so that we can increase the number of Americans on bicycles every day.
Et legat har gjort, at Anthony Siracusa skal bruge det næste år på cykelstier i hele verden. Første stop blev Danmark.
Denmark was a great place to begin because of how much work the national government and local governments are doing to promote bicycling.
Efter 8 uger på noget så dansk som cykelstier, lærer man også noget om den danske kultur.
I think being on a bicycle in Denmark is as close as you can come to being Danish in some ways.
Selvom det er et eventyr, Anthony Siracusa er cyklet ud i, får han også en viden, han vil bruge, når han kommer hjem til Memphis.
I think I can bring some insights, such as you should check out the traffic circle that they've got in Copenhagen. It works very well for bikes. It keeps folks very safe. Or check out the raised bike tracks. They're really wide and separated from car traffic, and it provides a sense of safety for bicycles.
En cykelentusiast, en mand med en mission.
Og i sandhed gode ben. Næste stop for Anthony Siracusa er Flensborg i Tyskland, så skal han til Holland, og derefter tramper han videre i Australien, Kina.
So part of the reason I share that is because it's kind of cool when you can get on international television. And like, I sent it, I put it on the blog, and like my friends back home were like, I didn't understand any of that, but it's great, People get really stoked about it. And so I think that's important. And I used that to illustrate, I think, kind of the importance of the Watson, because when people sort of saw, oh, he's like talking to Danish reporters, which, by the way, I stayed with this guy when I was in Odense who worked for TV2, and he's like, hey, let's go down to the station. I'll introduce you to the guys. And so he introduces me to all these guys, and I leave the next day, and he calls me. He's like, hey, I'm sending a video truck towards you. Where are you at right now? I was like, I have no idea. So I like look on the map, and they come, and they do this whole interview. It was wild, right? And then I got a Facebook request from some random Danish guy, and he's like, hey, if you come through my town, I'll give you a free massage. And I was like, I don't know. I'm not sure about that. So anyway, I didn't take him up on that. But it was fun, and it was cool, and I shared that with people back home, and they're like, hey, that's pretty awesome. And so then I'm still overseas, and they list me as being one of these 30 under 30 people for the Memphis Flyer, which is hilarious because I'm not even here, right? And they're like, oh yeah, this guy, he's really great. Where is he again, right? And so they list me, and they put all this stuff up here, and I talk a little bit about, and I think this is worth mentioning, I talk a little bit about what civil rights has meant to me. Growing up here after the assassination of Dr. King, the vestiges of the sanitation strike, decades of poverty surrounding us, it was really hard for me to resist doing something to make the city a better place to live. And that really is the truth. I mean, like I said, when I was younger, I just knew how to fix bikes. So we went to this church, they gave us some space, we opened it up, and we started working with kids. And that's a whole other story for a whole nother day. But that really was true for me. The assassination of King kind of stuck with me. So anyway, the Memphis Flyer, they're like, yeah, this guy, and they put that picture of me on a bike, and I looked really weird. And then a couple of other things happened on the Watson. I got a call from NPR in Colombia, like South America, Colombia. And they were like, hey, we'd like to do an interview with you. And I was in China at the time, so I talked about what was going on with China. And they've got this whole article in Spanish on the left side. I don't know if you can see it. And then on the right side, I had been down in Guatemala studying bici maquinas. These are like bike-powered machines, corn grinders, water pumps, blenders, a bunch of stuff. And they were working with campesinos, farmers down there to build these things. And some friends from Copenhagen were like, hey, we want you to come back and we want you to talk about this at this huge conference called Velocity Global, right? 45 countries represented, over 600 people from these countries, and I got to talk for 20 minutes in front of all these people as a plenary speaker. So that was rad, that was really cool, and that also helped, I think, raise the profile of the issue back home in Memphis. All right, I'm going to try to move quickly through the last bit of this because I want to be mindful of our time. Does anybody want to tell me how much time I have left? 5 minutes? 10 minutes? 7 minutes? 5 minutes? 7 minutes.
Damn.
5. All right, so we're gonna sprint here. I love to see us look through this book. It may be hard for an egg to turn into a bird, but it would be a jolly sight harder for it to learn to fly while remaining an egg. We're like eggs at present, and you cannot go on indefinitely just being an ordinary, decent egg. We must be hatched or go bad, right? That was how I saw Memphis coming back from the Watson. I was like, look, you guys are going to hatch, right, or you're going to go bad, right? We got to move some things, right? Mayor Ward was elected to serve in the city in October of 2009. That excited me, and so I made a choice. I made a choice to come back to Memphis. I had job opportunities in many places across the world. I didn't have to come back to the city of Good Abode, but I chose to come back here because I thought we were ready to be a bird, right? And I think we are. So the shake-up, I don't know if you guys remember, Mayor Wharton got really mad a couple of years ago because the city engineer had excluded bicycle lanes, but then he said he was going to include them, but then he didn't, and so basically he was lying. And so everybody's mad about that. And I wanted to show that video because AC doesn't really get mad, but he goes, if I was in the street, I'd use some different language with you, right? And I'm like, that's so AC. And so that's the video that I couldn't bring up, and I called my friend from the media thing the other day to get it, but we didn't connect. So Kyle Wagon Shoots gets hired, the work begins, right? So Memphis really seems to be turning a corner. But it wasn't easy, right? When we got back, we basically had to hold a demonstration downtown at City Hall. And I've got some footage from all that stuff, whatever. But these are quotes. We like created this rally to demand bike lanes, right? Marvin was helping me get some press going for that. But then it turned into kind of a celebration because the mayor said, we're adding bike lanes, and we're not just doing 32, we're doing 55. And so we got all these like angry people. I'm like, okay, that's great. And so it turned into this thing. And the mayor said, you're going to see it get done, right? And he made good on that promise. And we're over 40 miles into that at this point. So then, national press, who knew? Memphis on track to add 55 miles of bike lane in just 2 years. DC's picking this up. Streets Blog, one of the most important blogs for this kind of work in the country, right? And then I come back and I'm writing this thing. I said, there's momentum building here for a world-class bike culture, right? We can do it. And I said, in Memphis, riding a bike is increasingly a cool thing to do. And as a result, the city is well on its way to building a world-class bike culture. So it's about shifting the message a little bit. Not just about health, not just about the public space. It's also kind of fun. And on that note, one of my friends from Denmark, Michael Cole Anderson, he's an expert, right? If you want to get into PR and bikes, he is your guru. And he always shares this image. This is his picture. Does anybody know what that is? Yeah, it's a vacuum cleaner, right? And so why would he be talking about a vacuum cleaner when it comes to bicycles? He wanted to make the point that for the average Dane, or someone who lives in a country where loads of people are going by bike, a bike is just like a vacuum cleaner. It's a tool. It's just something that you use, right? And I think that's very important in terms of how we conceptualize what a bicycle is based on our context, right? And Cole Anderson, I think, has been really brilliant at doing that. So I started to talk about bikes being a more fun thing because I thought that youth would be more into it. I like these because, and I'm going to just share the Fitzgerald quote. The test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. One should, for example, be able to see things that are hopeless and yet be determined to make them otherwise, right? To me, that's Memphis, y'all. I mean, we got some problems, we got some things going on, but I know that you all here in this room and many people in the city have a vision of how to make it better. And that's really been what we have tried to do with the bicycle issue. You guys know this guy, Hunter S. Thompson. It's always good to quote Thompson. History is hard to know because of all the hired BS. And he doesn't say BS, right? And I share these things because this is what I'll conclude on, the last bit. we had to fight a couple of very public battles about bicycles in the last two years, basically. They weren't fun, right, but I do think they were necessary. And I'll explain to you how we tried to stay on the up and up throughout that process and stay positive. On Cooper Street, there was basically an argument about whether we put bike lanes in or whether we don't. And the issue came down to, do we remove some parking spaces to add the bicycle lanes, or do we just promote bicycle lanes in a different way and retain the parking spaces? We really tried to sort of search for a third way. The big thing to pull out of this is that sometimes if people don't understand what this can mean, you have to draw them a picture. And so we did that. We created this picture where we said, we're trying to create these facilities where it will be more safe for people to ride, protected bike lanes. And they may leave their cars at home, maybe free up some parking spots, right? It was a very tough argument to sell. And ultimately, it didn't work. But what did happen was by pushing this innovative bike facility, we shifted the dialogue from, should we have bike lanes at all, right, to let's have the best bike lanes in the world. And then when we landed with, well, let's just have some regular old bike lanes, right, and find some parking on another street. It was a very interesting campaign. It was a challenge because we were working in a perceived way against businesses, but ultimately, as you'll see now on Cooper Street, there are bike lanes, right? So that was a campaign that was successful. These are some designs that are taking hold across the world. We introduced these 2 years ago in Memphis, right? When I got back, I was like, look, we can put in regular old bike stuff, but we can do it the way that we know is going to work. And so we just started introducing all this crazy stuff, right? People were like, okay, maybe. But it really shifted the dialogue. We weren't just talking about bike lanes anymore. We're talking about innovative design that promotes the safest possible movement. And then we all know about Madison Avenue. That was a very long, very tiring campaign. And I'm going to pull out a couple of things here. John Branston, who is now my friend, has asked me to write for a book that he's doing, right? He was really being a hater, right, in a number of occasions on the bicycle lane. And he's basically like, look, for better or worse, Memphis is a car town. Biking and walking are much praised, but little practice. And I said, look, the problem here is your lack of hope for our city. And I felt that was the biggest obstacle to us making progress on this, right? So I took that on in a letter. I took it on in a longer editorial. And basically I made this point. Not a single mile of bicycle infrastructure would have happened had people not rallied behind it. This wasn't the government taking the lead, ladies and gentlemen. Remember, 10 years ago when we were talking about these issues, I said it's going to be Memphians who lead the way. And in fact, that was exactly what was happening here in the city of Memphis. That's a video. That's my buddy Greg. I'm not going to share that with you. But we ended up having to have a rally down at City Hall as a result of this issue. This is probably the most important slide of this whole section. We didn't say boycott businesses. We didn't say bikes are, you business owners are wrong about your perceptions. We just said we love safe streets and we love great streets. And that was our line, right? And we stuck to it. And we dug in on that because we know that streets that promote biking and walking are safer streets. We did this rally downtown. That's Chris Davidson's father. I think this is another issue to remember. Chris Davidson was killed while riding his bicycle on Madison in the midst of this campaign. So I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that that obviously played into the whole dialogue, right? His father came downtown and he painted that bicycle white in honor of his son, called it a ghost bike, right? He brought that to the rally. It was a very, very powerful symbol. We rallied, all the press showed up, there's some pictures. And then this is what I really love. Businesses that oppose Madison bike lanes are not advocates. And really, at the end of it, because at least for me and a number of people we worked with closely, we never said business owners are the problem, it's us against you. I can remember going to talk to some of these guys and I had Dr. King's Strength to Love book in my hand. And I would read from it before I went because I never wanted to burn a bridge with these folks. We were having a civic debate, right? And ultimately we tried to keep it positive for those reasons. All right, this is the Heritage Bridge. We're getting it done. New face for an old broad. You guys know about that too. I'm not going to talk about that. That's a guy in the bike lane. This is the very last thing I'll talk about. Memphis has made a lot of progress. This is a group of the bloggers who are participating in the Green Lane Project. As Martin said, we're promoting protected bike lanes throughout the United States. So remember the lists that Memphis appears on, right? Sometimes we're with Detroit or Newark, right? Or New Orleans, being the murder capital and all this stuff. Memphis is now in Boston, San Francisco, Washington, D.C., Chicago, and Portland, okay, as a Green Lane city, promoting protected bike lanes. We have now moved into a leadership position nationally on this issue, right? So I think it's a nice watermark. And it also shows how we can get this sort of thing done in a very difficult environment, which I think many American cities can relate to. Most improved city for biking. Harahan project, we're thinking about doing a bike share system like they have down in DC. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are rolling. Building relationships, building bike lanes, building community, it's all the same thing, right? And that's really been what I've tried to do since the very beginning. That's been my message. I've tried to do that actively through the bike shop and through a number of other initiatives. And I appreciate your time today and taking the time to listen. So, thanks so much.